Hello and welcome. You're watching the Scatter's Guy. This is the channel that's all about the mathematics, statistics, and game mechanics of Warhammer the Old World. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at unit or model profiles. Every unit in Warhammer the Old World has a profile, a set of 9 numerical characteristics which, together, represent the range of attributes which make the unit what it is. Of course, there is more to a unit than just its profile, for example, how it's equipped, what special rules it follows, and its points cost. Nonetheless, the basic numerical profile plays a pivotal role in how each unit will behave and interact with others on the battlefield. Learning to read, interpret, and evaluate unit profiles will therefore help you both when forming your army lists and in determining how best to engage with your opponent's units over the tabletop. The unit profile consists of a set of 9 numerical characteristics. These each represent an attribute of the unit, whether that be a physical attribute, such as how strong the models which form the unit are, proficiency at a core battlefield skill, such as hand-to-hand combat or shooting, or the unit's mental fortitude in the face of the trauma of battle. These 9 characteristics are movement, weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, toughness, wounds, initiative, attacks, and leadership. Movement is probably the most self-explanatory characteristic. It simply represents the distance the unit can travel when making a normal move over open terrain in inches. Units can move up to twice this distance when marching and 3 times this distance when in a marching column formation. Mounted models will often use the movement characteristic of their mount rather than the rider, which of course is one of the chief benefits of being mounted on the battlefield. Mounts are, without exception, selected to be faster than the model riding them, alongside other benefits. Some units also have the Fly X special rule, which allows them to use the distance indicated in place of their movement characteristic and pass freely over terrain and other models. Some units have the random movement special rule, meaning that their movement characteristic each turn is determined by rolling 1 or more d6. There are penalties to movement when traversing different terrain types. Units can also sacrifice some or all of their movement to change formation. A higher movement characteristic is generally beneficial as it allows you greater flexibility to position your units in advantageous locations on the battlefield and outmaneuver your opponents. Unlike other characteristics that make up the profile, movement is pretty much a fixed attribute of each race type in the Old World. Whilst many veteran troops or elite characters can surpass their baseline physiology of their race in terms of other fundamentally physical characteristics such as strength, toughness, or wounds, usually the only way to increase the movement characteristic is to take a mount. Movement characteristics are also important when charging. A higher movement characteristic giving the unit a greater charge range, increasing the likelihood that they will get the charge over their opponent. Many units receive combat benefits on the charge, and chargers get an initiative bonus during the first round of combat. There is a huge amount of strategic game value available if you can utilise your more mobile units effectively to make sure you are the player getting the charge wherever possible. Unlike some previous version of Warhammer Fantasy, charging in the old world is semi-random. For a normal charge, you roll 2d6 and discard the lower value, then add the remaining value to your unit's movement characteristic to determine the charge distance. I covered this discard mechanic in my Introduction to Mathhammer series, and I'll include a link to that video in the show notes. But as a recap, this mechanic weights the dice roll favourably towards higher outcomes, such that the minimum value of 6 is the single most probable result, and you'll roll a 5 plus at least 50% of the time. In other words, whilst there is a degree of randomness, you can still expect to succeed in charges of close to your unit's maximum charge range more often than not. You can see the probabilities of the different individual dice results here. Whilst the dice roll element of the charge will, under normal circumstances, be the same for all units, variations in the movement characteristic will inherently help some units achieve longer charges than others. For example, Goblin Wolf Riders with a base movement characteristic of 9 will always make a charge of at least 10 inches, their movement characteristic plus the worst case result of the charge roll of 1. In fact, due to the Swiss Stride special rule, which adds a further d6 to their charge distance, their minimum charge is even higher at 11 inches. In contrast, Ponderous Dwarfs with a base movement characteristic of just 3 will only make a maximum charge of 9 inches in the best case, their movement characteristic, plus the best case result of the charge roll of 6. By being smart about where they finish their move the preceding turn, the Goblin player can therefore effectively guarantee their unit the charge in this particular matchup. Of course, charging is not always so simple, and there are a number of quite interesting scenarios we can encounter. For example, there can be penalties such as when charging through terrain, or bonuses for units like the Goblin Wolf Riders with special rules such as Swift Stride. I plan on covering the mathematics and probabilities of these scenarios in detail in a future video. Weapon skill represents the unit's proficiency in close combat. Higher weapon skill values represent particularly skilled, experienced, or deadly warriors who are more likely to outclass their opponents in hand-to-hand combat. Weapon skill is a particularly interesting characteristic as it is both an offensive and defensive attribute. A higher weapon skill not only means that the unit is more proficient at attacking the opposing units, but it is also going to be better at defending itself from opposing attacks. The value you need to roll to score a hit in close combat is derived from the to hit chart based upon your units and the opposing unit's weapon skill characteristics. Whilst it's simplest just to consult the chart during normal play, it is interesting to understand the mathematical pattern it conforms to. This is demonstrated in the table on the screen. A is the attacking unit's weapon skill, and D is the defending unit's weapon skill. The attacking unit's weapon skill is more than twice the defending unit's. They hit on a 2+, resulting in a hit on average 83% of the time. If the attacker's weapon skill is greater than the defender's, but not more than double it, they hit on a 3+, resulting in a hit on average 67% of the time. If the attacker's weapon skill is anywhere from half to equal the defender's, they hit on a 4+, resulting in a hit on average 50% of the time. And if the attacker's weapon skill is less than half the defender's, they hit on a 5+, resulting in a hit on average 33% of the time. In principle, having a higher weapon skill than your opponent both increases your chances of hitting them and decreases their chances of hitting you. However, it is interesting to note that the relationship is asymmetrical. An offset in weapon skill values has a relatively greater impact on your offensive capabilities than it does on your defense. As an example, if both your unit and your opponent's unit each have a weapon skill of 3, you both hit on a 4+. That's a 50% chance. However, if your unit has a weapon skill of 4, you now hit on a 3+, increasing your prospects of scoring a hit to 67%, whereas your opponent still hits you on a 4+ as before. In this scenario, you would have to have a weapon skill of 7 before it becomes harder for your opponent to hit you. Weapon skill of 3 versus 7 requiring a 5+ to hit at a 33% chance. Whilst a higher weapon skill is therefore primarily an offensive benefit, it is worth remembering that the best defense is often a good offense. For units with a higher initiative characteristic, who usually get to strike first, a higher weapon skill will increase your chances of reducing enemy attacks by slaying opposing models before they can hit you back. This is particularly relevant when considering the mechanics of the stepping forward rule. More on this shortly. Ballistic skill represents a unit's proficiency with missile weapons. High ballistic skill meaning that a unit can shoot more accurately and is more likely to hit its target. The basic to hit value for shooting is determined by subtracting your unit's ballistic skill value from 7. So for example, a unit with a ballistic skill 3 will hit on a 4+. 7 minus 3 equaling 4. A roll of 1 is always failed, i.e. you can't get better than a 2+ to hit on any single roll. However, units with a ballistic skill of 6 or higher get to re-roll any failed rolls to hit. Such units will hit on a 2+ on the initial roll, or any modifiers are applied, but they usually have to achieve a high result on the re-roll, depending on just how high their ballistic skill is. The highest natural ballistic skill in the game is 7, achieved by a handful of Elven and Skaven units. The rulebook covers scenarios up to a ballistic skill of 10, though I've not managed to identify any scenarios that this can actually be achieved. Perhaps there's some combination of magic items and other buffs. If you manage to find a character build or similar which can achieve this, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Various modifiers will help reduce the effectiveness of your shooting. For example, moving and shooting, shooting at long range, shooting at units behind cover, etc. These all produce negative modifiers which require you to achieve a higher natural roll to hit. In the worst case, the standard modifiers can add up to -4, though there can be special cases where even more severe modifiers can be applied. It is important to note that these modifiers are applied to the to hit roll, not to the unit's ballistic skill characteristic. Units with ballistic skill of 6 or higher therefore still benefit from being able to re-roll failed hits, even if modifiers mean they no longer hit on a 2 plus on the initial roll. In some cases, you may end up needing to roll higher than a 6 to hit after modifiers are applied. In this case, you can still hit, but must re-roll the die twice, with a hit being scored on a 6, followed by anywhere between a 4 and a 6 on the second roll, depending on the specific target value required. I plan on covering the mathematics behind shooting in more detail in a future video, but for now, the table on the screen demonstrates the probabilities of scoring a hit based upon the unit's ballistic skill and the magnitude of any modifiers applied. An important question when evaluating ballistic skill is to consider whether your units will actually be armed with missile weapons. Higher values of ballistic skill are often associated with specialist missile units who will spend considerable time practicing and drilling with their chosen missile weapon to improve their proficiency. Units of infantry, whose primary role is hand-to-hand combat, will have a lower ballistic skill than dedicated missile units. Indeed, a fair few units have ballistic skill as low as 0, but this has no practical impact on their function in the game as they are not usually equipped to shoot anyway. If a unit is not equipped with missile weapons, you might as well ignore the ballistic skill characteristics, so low values in this case are not particularly concerning. Strength represents a unit's ability to wound an opponent, whilst toughness represents a unit's resistance to being wounded. After having scored a hit, you then roll on the to wound chart, comparing your unit's strength to your opponent's toughness characteristic to see if the hit results in a wound. A high strength characteristic will increase the damage output of your unit, whilst a high toughness characteristic increases its survivability. Strength and toughness often go together, meaning that units with a higher value for one characteristic often have a higher value for the other as well, though this is not universally the case. There are a number of ways strength and toughness characteristics can be modified. Mounted units usually benefit from a combined profile, whereby the rider shares some characteristics with their mount. In the case of particularly mighty or monstrous mounts, the rider often benefits from a boost to their toughness characteristic, as indicated in the mount's profile. For example, a Bretonnian Duke on a Royal Pegasus gets +1 to their toughness characteristic. Many weapons convey a bonus to the wielder's strength characteristic, though this often comes at a cost. For example, great weapons add +2 to the wielder's strength characteristic, but require 2 hands and suffer from the strike's last special rule, so there is a trade-off when deciding whether to equip or use these. Various enchantments, hexes, and magical items can also modify a unit's strength and toughness characteristics. Missile weapons usually have their own strength value, which is used rather than the units when rolling to wound for shooting attacks. This is given in the weapon profile. The basic to wound value is equal to 4 minus the attacker's strength plus the defender's toughness, with the caveat that you can never get better than a 2 plus to wound, a roll of 1 is always a failure, and the worst to wound value you can get is capped at 6 plus. So if the defender's toughness is more than 2 higher than the attacker's strength, you still always wound on a roll of 6, except if the defender's toughness is 6 or more greater than the attacker's strength, in which case a wound is simply not possible. In this case, the attacker is so weak relative to the toughness of the defender that they simply do not possess the strength to do any meaningful harm. This is clearly a combat you're going to wish to avoid. The table here demonstrates the probabilities of a successful hit wounding the enemy unit based upon their relative strength and characteristics. The wounds characteristic represents a unit's ability to shrug off physical harm and carry on the fight. The majority of units in the game only have a single wound, meaning that if a wound is dealt, the model is slain and removed from play. However, more hardy and heroic units are able to sustain multiple injuries, which would lay others to rest. This is represented by having multiple wounds on their profile. A model with multiple wounds on its profile is unaffected until it has lost all of its wounds. Once they have suffered a number of wounds equal to their wounds characteristic, they are slain like any other model and removed from play. Having multiple wounds is clearly a boon to the unit, increasing its survivability throughout the game. Initiative represents how fast and quick thinking a unit is in close combat. In combat, units usually fight in initiative order, with the highest initiative value going first. Having a higher initiative value can be incredibly powerful, and it cannot be overstated just how significant the initiative value is in the new rule set for the old world compared to some previous versions. It is usually only models in the front rank that can fight, and as a result of the stepping forward rule, which states that models stepping into the front rank to replace fallen comrades cannot fight in the current turn, going second in combat can often mean your unit has a reduced number of attacks with which to fight back as a consequence of any wounds suffered. In the worst case scenario, if your opponent deals enough wounds to wipe out your entire front rank, and assuming no surviving characters or champions and no weapons that allow you to fight in multiple ranks, you are not able to hit back at all. In contrast, the unit that strikes first always gets to deliver their full complement of attacks. High initiative therefore conveys both offensive and defensive benefits, maximising your ability to deal damage to your opponent's units while simultaneously reducing their ability to deal damage back. Like all characteristics, there are various scenarios that can modify initiative. Most significantly, a charging unit benefits from an initiative bonus. This makes getting the charge in, as opposed to being charged by your opponent, particularly important, as who charges who will often, though not always, be the determining factor in who strikes first during the first round of combat. When combined with other first round of combat bonuses which the unit may benefit from due to their equipment or special rules, first round of combat is therefore often particularly important and decisive. The attacks characteristic represents the unit's ability to deal out damage during close combat. Most units only have a single attack, however, some particularly skilled or savage warriors have the ability to strike at the enemy multiple times during each round of combat. Higher attacks characteristic is clearly beneficial, as the unit has more opportunities to deal damage to your opponent. One point to note, however, is that models which are not in base-to-base contact, but can still fight because they are in the fighting rank, only ever get to make a single supporting attack, regardless of their attacks characteristic. Getting as many models as possible into base-to-base contact with the enemy during combat is therefore significantly more important for units with multiple attacks, so that you can maximise their damage output. A high attacks value in combination with a high wounds value can make a unit particularly powerful, noting that the unit gets to fight back with its full complement of attacks even when wounded, until it has lost all of its wounds and is removed from play. For example, if a model with wounds 4 and attacks 4 receives 3 wounds, it still gets to continue fighting with all 4 attacks. In contrast, if you instead had 4 models with wounds 1 and attacks 1, so the same total number of wounds and attacks, and the unit receives the same 3 wounds, only 1 model is remaining, as the 3 wounded models are removed from play, and you only therefore get 1 attack back. The final characteristic on the unit profile is leadership. Leadership represents a unit's ability to keep a cool and calm head amidst the chaotic clamour of battle. There are a wide range of scenarios where a unit will be required to take a leadership test during the game, usually when scary things happen amidst the course of the battle, either directly to the unit itself or in close proximity to it. In most cases, the consequence of failing such a test is that the unit turns and runs away. Fleeing units are a problem for a number of reasons, partly as you no longer have control over them, at least until you successfully rally them and can't put them to effective use on the battlefield, partly as they can in turn induce panic and cause other nearby units to flee, but most significantly as there is an increased risk of losing the unit entirely, either if they are run down by the enemy or if they carry on fleeing and leave the table. Fleeing unit is incredibly vulnerable, ironically often more so than if the same unit had kept its cool and carried on the fight. It's actually relatively rare that a unit be completely destroyed in combat in the old world. Far more often, a unit is lost because it breaks and flees after losing a round of combat and is then run down by the pursuing enemy unit. In other cases, units may be subject to special rules which result in random or erratic behaviour if they do not pass a leadership test in certain situations. For example, the unit with the impetuous special rule has a headstrong lust for battle, which can result in it charging uncontrollably at the enemy, even if the general is ordering it otherwise. If such a unit is in a position to charge any enemy unit, it must do so unless it successfully passes a leadership test. An interesting nuance of leadership is that units can often use the leadership value of others in many situations. For example, if a character has joined the unit, the whole unit benefits from the character's increased leadership. Similarly, units which are within the command range of your general, who is always the highest leadership character in the army, benefit from the inspiring presence rule and can use the general's leadership value in many situations. Positioning characters in such a way as to most effectively lend their leadership to other units is often key to the performance of an army on the battlefield, particularly for natively lower leadership. Take a leadership test, you roll 2d6 and compare the sum to the highest leadership value available to the unit. If the result is higher than that leadership value, the test is failed. I covered the sum of 2d6 mechanic again in my Introduction to Warhammer series, but to recap here, the sum of 2d6 can be anywhere in the range of 2 to 12, with results in the middle of the range being most likely. The single most probable result is a 7, which will occur 1/6 of the time, whilst results at the extremities, such as a 2 given by rolling a double 1, or a 12 given by rolling a double 6, are much rarer, with a 1 in 36 probability in each case. Here you can see the probabilities of rolling at or above given target values. Remember that for leadership tests we want to avoid rolling above the leadership characteristic, so low probabilities on this graph are better. You can see that we can expect to roll a 7 plus just over half the time, so units with leadership values of 6 or lower are likely to fail leadership tests more often than they pass them, which can be problematic. Players fielding such armies will need to be prepared for their erratic and often unpredictable behaviour on the battlefield. Leadership values in the game range from as low as 3, as attained by the ever-reliable Cave Squig, to 10, which is usually the reserve of Lord-level characters from the more disciplined races. The table here shows the probabilities of passing a basic unmodified leadership test based upon the unit's leadership characteristic or any character's leadership which is lent to the unit. As is almost always the case, there are various scenarios in the game which can modify a unit's leadership characteristic or the results of a leadership test. Again, I plan to cover this in much more detail in a future video. When looking at unit profiles, it's helpful to establish a frame of reference. Page 97 of the Old World Rulebook provides a very useful example profile in this respect, as reproduced here. The example profile is for a soldier of the Empire. Now, Empire players will likely note that this is not actually a specific playable unit from their army list, but rather it's representative of a selection of their unit options. For example, Empire state troops and state missile troops share this profile. The same profile is also shared by units from other human factions, for example, Bretonnian squires. This profile is representative of a typical professional human soldier with a basic level of training, which makes it a very good frame of reference for the game at large. Humans in the old world are quite a middling race, neither the weakest nor the strongest, fastest nor the slowest, most nor least skilled or disciplined in comparison to the various other races you will encounter. Even within the human factions, there can be significant variations on this profile between units. For example, veteran units will often have higher values for a range of characteristics, particularly ballistic or weapon skill and leadership. These not being fundamental physical attributes of the race, but skills and behaviours which can be sharpened and refined through the advanced training and experience of such units. In contrast, forces of untrained peasant levies or unruly militia will often have lower values for these characteristics for the opposite reason. They are not practiced and drilled professional soldiers, but ragtag bands of troops thrust into battle, often with little preparation or choice in the matter. Many units can take a champion, who will often benefit from a higher attacks characteristic for close combat units, or a ballistic skill characteristic for missile units. Champions will also sometimes have a higher leadership characteristic. This is often the case in natively lower leadership factions, for example orcs and goblins, and makes taking unit champions particularly valuable for those armies. Particularly elite units, as well as most characters, will not only have further improved combat skills and leadership, but may also have honed their physical attributes beyond that typical of their peers. For example, enabling them to strike faster, so higher initiative and attacks, hit harder, higher strength, and shrug off injuries, which might mean the end for ordinary members of their race, so higher toughness and wounds characteristics. How these specifically play out for different units and characters is quite variable, and there's often a degree of choice here in terms of the unit selection. Now that we have a good frame of reference, we'll finish by taking a look at the range of different factions and races in the game to get a feel for how they compare. The table here demonstrates representative baseline profiles for each race type found within the Old World. It is of course important to acknowledge that this is just a baseline, usually representative of the most fundamental core unit options for each race, and more elite choices will of course exceed many of the quoted characteristic values. I hope to do some faction-specific deep dives into the varying profiles of different unit types at some point in the future. But for now, we'll just look at each race in turn. Firstly, looking at humans. We've already discussed humans in a reasonable level of detail. Humans are quite a middling race, with neither the highest nor lowest baseline values for any characteristics. Players of human factions can expect a versatile, all-round force which can be adapted to a range of playstyles, though specific factions will of course lend themselves to some styles more than others based upon the unit choices available. Dwarfs are stouter and less nimble than a human, resulting in a naturally lower movement and initiative characteristic. However, they also have a number of advantages. They tend to be a more martial people, and the majority of dwarf units, excepting only those who have specialised in the use of ranged weapons, have a relatively high weapon skill. They have naturally high toughness characteristics. They're also a particularly proud people who can rarely be routed from battle, with the highest base leadership characteristic of any faction in the game. Even the lowliest dwarf having a leadership value matching the generals of most other races. Low manoeuvrability means that the dwarf playstyle is going to be naturally more defensive, backed up by a solid selection of artillery. The dwarf force is going to do a lot of damage at range whilst waiting for the opponent to come to them. Dwarfs are relatively more likely to receive than deliver a charge, and will be hitting second in combat against most opponents. However, once engaged, dwarfs are hard to kill, pack a punch, and will rarely run away, presenting a solid and immovable obstacle to your opponents from which they will have difficulty extracting victory points. Elves, on the other hand, are fast, with high movement and initiative characteristics, lending them greater manoeuvrability, increasing their prospects of getting the charge, and usually striking first against most opponents. They also have naturally high weapon skill and ballistic skill, and also high leadership, making them an all-round high-performing force across most characteristics. With only an average toughness, survivability will be their main concern in consideration of their relatively high points cost, particularly for wood elves who are generally limited to light or no armour. Wood elves in particular are likely to favour missile attacks and range play whenever possible. Once engaged in close combat, elven units will be relying upon their high initiative and weapon skill to take out opposing models before they can strike back. Whilst their weapon skill increases the chances of getting the hits in, their middling strength characteristic is likely to limit damage output against tougher opponents, so engaging these with the right units, such as elite or specially equipped troops, will be particularly important. Orcs and goblins are really two connected races rather than a single archetype. As you can see, I've split these out in the table here. Orcs are not too dissimilar to humans, at least on the level of their baseline profile. They trade lower leadership for an increased toughness characteristic, making them slightly less predictable but relatively harder to kill. Goblins are the orcs' weedier, smaller, more cowardly cousins. With particularly low leadership, they are often unpredictable and at risk of fleeing the battlefield. With a low weapon skill and initiative, they will not fare too well against most other races in an even combat, but a fair fight is not a fight your average goblin is particularly keen on in any case. Night goblins are an interesting variant on your standard goblin and trade even lower leadership for an improved initiative. For all their unpredictability, orcs and goblins are a surprisingly resourceful rabble who make up for their own shortcomings via a combination of sheer numbers and through the particularly large roster of special troop types and monstrous creatures such as squigs, trolls, and giants, which they are able to shepherd into battle on their behalf. Orcs and goblins are probably, more than any other faction in the game, an army very susceptible to the winds of chance, with a lot of units that will behave in random and unpredictable ways on the battlefield. For the discerning commander, the unreliability and inconsistency of this army will be a frustration, and I can't imagine it's going to be many people's first choice for genuinely competitive play. But if your joy is discovered in the simple pleasures of unleashing a bucket load of anarchic chaos onto the battlefield, then watching how it plays out, you're going to find playing orcs and goblins a seriously fun time. Beastmen are an interesting faction to try and pin down to a single archetype. Each unit on the Beastmen roster is physiologically unique. Nonetheless, taking Gauls as the most multitudinous and representative example of something approximating the standard Beastman, we can consider their profile a reasonably suitable reference for the faction as a whole. Other unit choices broadly scale from this baseline in a similar manner to most other factions. This being the case, we can see that beastmen are fast, vicious, and tough, with high movement, weapon skill, and toughness characteristics respectively. The only major compromise on their profile is the relatively low leadership characteristic. Ballistic skill is also low, but as very few Beastmen units have options for missile weapons, and even then limited only to throwing spears, range combat is never going to be a big part of the Beastmen battle plan. For a Beastmen army, the game plan is going to be all about activating the force's high mobility to close with the enemy and engage them in close combat as rapidly as possible. Ogres are another interesting force, not so much because they're difficult to define in terms of a single archetype, as was the case for Beastmen, but rather as they are simply so different from any other faction in the game. In an ogre army, almost every model is a monster in its own right. One on one, even your baseline ogre is going to outclass other races on almost every count, but that's not really a fair comparison. Ogres come with a high points cost, so in match play, an ogre army is going to have a very low overall model count, usually deployed in relatively small units, and will almost always be vastly outnumbered. The basic mathematical paradigm for ogres, therefore, is going to be a question of how many enemy troops each ogre can take out before the opposing player's greater numbers successfully come to bear. Even for elite troops, facing up to an ogre is going to be a daunting prospect. The one saving grace for opposing players will be the ogre's low initiative. The ogre is going to hit you hard, but at least for most opposing factions, you are going to get to hit him first. Compared to their living counterparts, the typical reanimated corpse has a low ballistic skill, weapon skill, and initiative. They also have a low leadership, though this tends to work rather differently for the undead than other forces due to their special rules. Strength for the undead player lie in places other than their stat lines, at least for their core units, and are primarily a product of their special rules, which at least partially moderate the impacts of their lower characteristic values, as well as their frustrating habit of refusing to die properly once and for all. Both Tomb Kings and Vampire Counts also have access to a diverse range of more fantastical units with incredibly varied profiles, allowing them to support a core of skeletons and zombies on a variety of ways. Lizard men, similar to orcs and goblins or beastmen, are really a collection of associated races rather than just variations on a single archetype. The two main racial types which make up the bulk of any lizardmen army are skinks and saurus, though one might argue that the mighty Kroxigor and the mystical Slan are a third and fourth respectively. Skinks are very fast, with a particularly high baseline movement characteristic of 6, and also a high initiative. However, they'll struggle to hold up in close combat against most opponents due to their low weapon skill and toughness characteristics. They are also low leadership, though this is partially mitigated by their special rules. Their primary role in battle is likely to be to act as a skirmish screen or to hold up enemy units whilst their larger, tougher cousins and range of monstrous unit options get themselves into position. Saurus are a very different prospect. They are big and hardy warriors with high strength and toughness characteristics. They also have higher than average leadership, giving them a bit more staying power. Most significantly, justifying their relatively high points cost for a basic infantry unit, they pack 2 attacks apiece. On the negative side, they have the lowest baseline initiative in the game, so expect to be striking last. Their ballistic skill of 0 is a bit of a red herring, as there are no missile weapon options for them in any case. Overall, a Lizardmen army is likely to have a very juxtaposed playstyle between fast but light units on the one hand and more ponderous but heavy hitters on the other. Finally, looking at Skaven, the last main race in the old world. The Verminous Skaven are another faction that relies heavily on their pace, with high movement and initiative characteristics. This is traded against faction-wide low base leadership values, with even their Lord level characters only achieving the very middling leadership 7. Though in practice, the Scurry Away special rule will often help to bolster their courage and boost the effective leadership of most units to more reasonable values, provided there are other friendly units nearby. Skaven are another faction whose true value is found in their special rules, elite units, and the exotic array of equipment choices available to them, demonstrating that whilst unit profiles provide many valuable insights, they are only ever a part of the complete picture. There is one more faction you'll notice that's not included in this table, which is of course Demons of Chaos. These legions of darkness are so bizarre and twisted that it's not really possible to pin down any single representative profile, but you can have fun exploring the army list and comparing specific units for yourself. I hope this has been helpful and of interest. I particularly want to thank all of those who've been following and engaging with the channel so far. The reaction in particular to my last video was incredibly humbling. To everyone who has commented, hit the like button or subscribed, please know that it really means a lot to me as a new content creator. If you have questions or simply want to chat about any of the content of this video, do hit me up in the comments. Likewise, whilst I have lots of ideas for future videos, I would also love to hear from you about the Mathhammer questions you want to have answered. Finally, as always, don't forget that detailed show notes will be available to supporters on my Patreon. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.